The second Saturn game released on December 2nd, 1994 is Shinsetsu Yumimi Yakata, Tobira no Oko ni Dari Kaga, Our Real Dream Mansion, Someone Behind the Door, an FMV adventure game that is a sequel to the 1993 Mega CD game Yumimi Yakata no Monogatari, Our Story of the Dream Mansion. As with Gale Racer, the game was developed by System Sacom and published by Sega, but the two games couldn't be more different. The Yumimi Yakata series is better known in the West as Mansion of Hidden Souls, although the Mega CD version was released in Europe under the curiously literal translation Yumimi Mystery Mansion. These games have something of a small Western cult fandom, but they're still fairly obscure. There's even quite a bit of confusion around just the naming of these games, especially in America. While the Sega CD version was titled Mansion of Hidden Souls, the Saturn version was titled The Mansion of Hidden Souls, with only the added "the" differentiating the two titles. Because of that, it is often assumed that the Saturn version, which was released in America and Europe in late 1995, is simply a port of the Sega CD game with improved FMV. But it is indeed a sequel, albeit one with only a few direct ties to its predecessor. The unifying premise behind the Mansion of Hidden Souls series is the existence of a mansion that sits between our reality and another world. This mansion only materializes in the real world under a full moon, and those who enter it will leave their corporeal forms behind to become butterflies. The mansion is inhabited by these butterflies, who once lived human lives before they decided they'd prefer to live in the titular Dream Mansion. The premise of Mansion of Hidden Souls is admittedly pretty strange, especially for a console game from the mid-90s. While it was greeted with a warm reception in Japan, where it received a 32 out of 40 from Famitsu and was more recently included as one of the Mega CD titles on Sega's Mega Drive Mini 2 console, Western reception of the first game was mixed. EGM's review crew gave it scores ranging between 9 and 6, while relegating the review text to a single paragraph. GamePro was mostly positive, while still dismissing it as a clone of the early PC CD-ROM hit The Seventh Guest. But VideoGames magazine named it among the worst games of 1994, again bringing up The Seventh Guest comparison while griping about the game's short length. It's clear that the American console-focused game magazines of the time didn't have the context to fully understand what Mansion of Hidden Souls was really trying to do. Nor did its American publisher, Vic Tokai, which tried to sell the game with this goofy ad featuring a radical dude who was literally shocked by the horrors contained within. Mansion of Hidden Souls is thick with eerie atmosphere, but it doesn't really deliver much in the way of traditional horror. Nor is it really appropriate to compare it with The Seventh Guest, a game that's built on a mix of brain teasers and campy live-action storytelling.
My, isn't this a cheery place?
Edward, I'm not sure we should have been here today.
Why? Because it's a spooky old house? Don't worry, dear. I'll watch out for you.
Instead, Mansion of Hidden Souls is a continuation of a style of game that was popular in Japan, but practically unknown in the West at the time. A decidedly Japanese take on the graphical adventure that developer System Sacom had already been refining for years before it made Mansion of Hidden Souls. System Sacom isn't a particularly well-known developer, especially in the West, but it has a fascinating and deep history. Founded in 1981, System Sacom began its life as a hardware manufacturer specializing in computer peripherals, but soon expanded into other fields, including video games. Its earliest games, such as 1983's Valiant and 1986's Highway Star, were for NEC's popular PC-9801 line of computers. These were credited to Mark-Flint, who was hailed as a genius programmer for feats such as the polygonal engine behind Highway Star, which delivered a relatively smooth 3D racing experience within the limitations of early PC-9801 hardware. Later on, Mark-Flint would also work on Famicom Disk System games such as Moonball Magic as part of the Disk Original Group, our dog, a group that included System Sacom as well as several other developers, most notably a pre-Final Fantasy Square. To this day, Mark-Flint's identity is a bit of a mystery. Despite his name, he is believed to be Japanese, and he does seem to be a real person, even if it's quite possible he's using a pseudonym. A compilation released for PC-9801 featuring his early games, All About Mark-Flint, only features a pixelated and obscured photo of a man on the cover. There is an interview of him by now defunct Japanese gaming website GPara from 2006, which can now only be retrieved from the Wayback machine, but unfortunately the images were not archived. He does talk a bit about his time at System Sacom, and confirms that he also worked on at least the Sega CD version of Mansion of Hidden Souls. Starting in 1988, System Sacom's game development focus started to shift away from Mark-Flint's action-oriented games towards more narrative-heavy works with its Novelware series. These are Japanese adventure games taking influence from popular titles like Yuji Horii and Chunsoft's Portopia Renzoku Sasuten Jiken, or the Portopia Serial Murder Case, which differed from Western graphical adventures in their first-person perspective and emphasis on storytelling over inventory-driven puzzle solving. But as the Novelware name suggests, these games move further towards what would eventually be known as visual novels, limiting player control in favor of narrative. Although the Novelware games aren't strictly considered visual novels by modern genre standards, due to still retaining some of the freedom of the classic Japanese adventure game style. The first Novelware game, 1988's Dome, was released for most of the popular Japanese computer platforms of the time, including the PC-9801 and X68000. It's based on a novel by Japanese writer Shizuko Natsuki, probably best known in the West for her novel Murder at Mount Fuji. The titular Dome is a shelter designed to protect humans after a nuclear war. You may expect such a premise to result in a game set in a post-apocalyptic dystopia, but the game actually takes place in a normal Japanese office, where you, as an employee of an advertising agency, are tasked with finding ways to promote the dome so money can be raised for its construction. While the presentation is simple, the use of digitized photographs stands out, especially for a game from 1988. It's definitely not what you might expect, but it shows how System Sacom was already thinking about how to tell stories in video games that bucked against the norms. There were eventually 7 Novelware games released, ranging across a variety of genres, including forays into sci-fi, horror, and even comedy in a slyly meta-satire of the game industry, Soft De Hard na Monogatari, in which you play the son of the CEO of a thinly veiled fictional version of System Sacom. After your father becomes ill, you must temporarily take over running the company while he recovers, and of course hijinks ensue. As with several other games in the Novelware series, Soft De Hard na Monogatari uses digitized black and white manga drawings to great effect.
Look! A butterfly!
Wow! Look how it just floats in the air.
So carefree, so beautiful. Hey, let's follow it to see where it goes. Maybe it'll fly to the flower garden under the old elm tree.
No way! We better go home or we'll be in big trouble. Besides, Grandma told us never to go anywhere near the elm tree. Remember, she said that there's ghosts there, and that they turn us into butterflies if we stared at one long enough, especially during a full moon.
You said there was no such thing as ghosts. Besides, I think it would be fun to be a butterfly.
Hey, wait! No! Where am I? How can this be? There was no mansion here before.
Jonathan! Over here! Quick, I'm over here!
The Sega CD version of Mansion of Hidden Souls isn't nearly as text-heavy as the Novelware games, nor does it so thoroughly remove agency from the player. The Novelware games often had extended segments that are purely narrative with no player control. But it's clear that System Sacom's work in developing narrative-heavy adventure games was crucial to the game's development. You can see this just in the confidence of its storytelling and presentation. The game plays out from immediately after the Sega logo right into an introduction that sets up the premise and throws you directly into the beginning of the game, with only a brief pause for a title screen. In a nod to the first-person perspective of the Novelware games and other Japanese adventure games of the era, the viewpoint almost never breaks from the first person, other than the brief game over sequence. While there isn't that much voice acting in the game, every line is voiced. There is virtually no written text in the game. The soundtrack, by Rurichi Sakamoto protege and occasional Studio Ghibli collaborator Yuji Nomi, hits every right note, From the stately and melancholic waltz of the introduction to the ethereal loops and drones that accompany you as you explore the mansion. For a game that was on the cutting edge for its time, it's presented with an incredible amount of stylistic verve and confidence. The protagonist of Mansion of Hidden Souls is Jonathan, a boy who is out in the field at night playing with his sister Samantha when they come upon a butterfly. Jonathan relays a tale he heard from his grandmother about ghosts that turn people into butterflies during a full moon. Samantha, perhaps expressing a childish whim, thinks it would be fun to be a butterfly and runs off. A pan up of the camera reveals a full moon in the sky, then the pan back down reveals a mansion and a title screen. Jonathan enters the mansion, wondering to himself how it just mysteriously appeared, only to hear Samantha calling him in the distance. Exploring the mansion is a simple matter of four-way directional movement. Like many early FMV adventures, exploration is node-based. You navigate from one location to the next, with brief FMV transitions as you walk around or zoom in on objects of interest. As you move around the mansion, you come upon its various inhabitants, all of whom are blue butterflies who abandoned their past lives as humans. There's an immature young girl cajoling you into joining her for tea.
I have prepared some tea in a room near here. Won't you join me?
A musician who expresses regret over becoming a butterfly.
I remember when I was human. I was on a small stage together with my friends and I played the piano. Now I cannot even touch the keys. I had many pressures and I felt there was no other choice. So at the time I thought it would be wonderful to be like a butterfly, to be carefree. I know now that I made the wrong decision.
A creepy butterfly collector giving you the hard sell on taking up the butterfly lifestyle.
What do you think? They're gorgeous, ain't they? I think the butterfly's as beautiful as the soul. I visited this mansion to obtain this shape, the shape of souls. Why don't you become a butterfly and lose that ugly human form?
A friendly and helpful painter.
I assume you'd like to be a butterfly. If so, take my word for it. Never venture below the main floor.
And a mocking middle-aged woman with a Romani accent that veers just a bit too hard into stereotype.
Did you hear that? That was the voice of your sister. You want to see her? I don't think so.
As you talk to these characters and solve the odd simple puzzle here and there, you'll occasionally hear your sister in the distance, increasingly distraught as she realizes she's really going to be turned into a butterfly even though she doesn't want to.
Who are you? I'm not alone, you know. I'm with my brother. Jonathan! Jonathan, where are you?
Mansion of Hidden Souls is a short game, and a simple one. For around the first 2/3 of the game, you'll simply be going around the mansion trying to trigger the next event. It might at first seem that it's impossible to die, but when the third act kicks in, you're suddenly very much in danger. This is done in a way that's a bit on the trollish side, as you will die instantly simply by going one step too far. Then very shortly afterwards, instant death is again one wrong move away. In the last stretch of the game, you're on a fairly strict timer to solve a final series of puzzles, which seriously ratchets up the tension. But since the game allows you to save anywhere and there are 3 save slots, it's unlikely to lead to much in the way of lost progress as long as you are careful about saving frequently. Mansion of Hidden Souls has its share of flaws. While its CG is impressive for 1993, the limitations of the Sega CD mean that the FMV is grainy and choppy. As with many Japanese adventure games, it also ties its progression to a lot of specific, often seemingly arbitrary event triggers. As a somewhat awkward workaround for this, there is a hint system built into the game. Looking into a mirror in a certain location will reveal where you need to go next. It's a band-aid, but it's better than nothing. And Mansion of Hidden Souls is ultimately a pretty slight and simple game, a proof of concept for how this evolution of Japanese adventure games could work. But the story's relative simplicity belies the symbolism that lies under the surface. This is a much more artfully told narrative than you'd expect from a 16-bit console game. In Western mythology, butterflies have a fairly straightforward interpretation as symbols of metamorphosis and rebirth. But butterflies in Japan can have some more esoteric meanings. In the article Cultural Lepidopterology in Modern Japan, Butterflies as Spiritual Insects in the Akihabara Culture, Dr. Hideto Hoshina lays out some of the ways butterflies are used symbolically in Japanese culture. They are often used to represent souls, and their flight can symbolize a connection between the real world and the dream world, both of which thematically connect to the game. But there's an even further connection. Butterflies in Japan have had a long tradition in art as representations of a girl's journey into womanhood, and Mansion of Hidden Souls is about rescuing a young girl who expresses a desire to turn into a butterfly. So we must ask if Mansion of Hidden Souls is about Jonathan's anxieties as much as it is about rescuing his damseled sister. Is Jonathan worried about losing his sister as she enters womanhood? Is any of this real, even within the context of the game, or is the mansion all a manifestation of Jonathan's psychological anxieties? The game's original title is Story of the Dream Mansion after all. Applying this kind of analysis to an old video game may seem absurd, but something about the way Mansion of Hidden Souls adroitly navigates its dream logic invites interpretation. You can ignore all this and simply take Mansion of Hidden Souls as an artfully crafted, minimalist adventure game in the 90s multimedia CD-ROM mold. But there's a lot more lying under the surface here than it may first appear. While a game of this type and vintage may be a bit too slow and creaky for most folks, it's highly recommended for anyone with even a hint of interest in adventure games or 90s multimedia.
Wait, young lad. Where are you going? Don't go!
The Saturn game arrived in Japan almost exactly a year after the Japanese release of its predecessor. While it does have some direct ties to the Sega CD game, it has a largely new cast of characters, including a new protagonist, June. Unlike Jonathan, June is a butterfly who has been living in the mansion for an undetermined period of time. We never learn much about June or why they first came to the mansion. The given name June in Japanese can belong to either gender, so it seems that June has purposefully been left as an anonymous player avatar. June is enjoying another night of just butterflying around when they're summoned by the mansion's elder.
Welcome, June. What are you doing over there? Come here. June, how long is it since you last came here? Well, since turning my back on human society and changing my form to that of a butterfly. Oh, no. I haven't called you here to talk about the old days. It appears that Mike has come too.
June, you're here too. Can I help you, Elder?
They're joined by another butterfly, Mike, a cheery British gent. There's a full red moon out tonight, and that's a bad omen. The Elder tasked June and Mike with investigating. As with the Sega CD game, this leads to another round of poking about the mansion and talking to a new set of inhabitants. A few seem to have carried over from the previous game, although they might just be repeated archetypes. There's Kathy, a little girl who's sweet but has a slightly twisted side. Jossie, another middle-aged woman who embodies some Romani stereotypes, although at least the accent is dropped. Raymond, who was an adventurer in his human life. Sean, a frightened young boy who loves plants. Nezumi, a greedy shopkeeper in Lush. And Danny, a brutish man with a dark past. Eventually, a blue book gets stolen, which then leads to a series of increasingly improbable and inexplicable twists that somehow escalate to a life-and-death finale on another plane of reality, as two supernatural beings duke it out via philosophical musings on the nature of the mansion. The Mansion of Hidden Souls doesn't have the simplicity or elegance of the Sega CD game, and its overly literal explanation falls flat compared to its predecessor's tasteful ambiguity. But it definitely goes places. The lack of cohesive narrative makes it a slog for most of its brief runtime, but the occasional bizarre detours, and especially the batshit ending, almost make up for it. The game is extremely easy for the most part. There are a few ways you can die, but there's no time limit as there was at the end of the Sega CD game, and there really isn't even anything approaching a puzzle. The sole gameplay addition is the ability to answer simple yes or no questions when talking with characters. It seems like this was considered a key gameplay element during development, as the one option in the game settings is the switch between normal and easy mode, which just flips whether or not an on-screen prompt appears when a dialogue choice is available. Most of these answers don't have much of an effect other than some slightly different dialogue, or skipping a bit of optional dialogue, but a handful of life or death consequences. This could have worked out well, but in practice it just means that you're randomly going to take a cheap death or two throughout the game.
This is supposed to be Nezumi's room.
Hi there. Do you like this painting? I painted this. Everyone is individually painting his own mind inside himself. In this room you can see them all. You should be able to see your own here. Well, please don't take what I said too seriously. I am only a painter. The painting you have in your mind seems rather ugly. It has suspicious eyes, a sarcastic smile, and is holding a knife which could hurt someone. But that sort of human is not at all welcome in this mansion.
You can save whenever you want again, but this time you need to go to a specific location to save, which just artificially pads out a game that's already shorter than its already short predecessor. Furthermore, the changes to the game's style to add more dialogue do not work to its benefit. Having Mike around constantly commenting on everything gets annoying in record time, and none of these characters are appealing or enjoyable. It speaks a lot to the quality of the game's dialogue that its best known part is this unhinged clip from Classics of Game, in which Kathy tells a story that freaks Mike the fuck out.
Hey, Kathy!
Will you play with me?
What would you like to play?
Okay then, I'll tell you a story. Please listen. Once upon a time, there was a strange, enchanting place. Clouds always filled the sky, so it was very dark. Everybody stayed very still. But when the clouds went away and the moon appeared, that's when the festival began. Then everybody went out hunting to get food for a big party. And guess what they ate for the big feast?
Ah!
The FMV quality has improved immensely, but a jarring new addition is the presence of human faces when the butterflies are talking. It seems like System Sacom was trying to flex its CG prowess by showing off human faces, but they're mostly short loops, and they look absolutely goofy as hell. Other than that though, the new CG looks quite nice. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like Yuji Nomi returned to compose the soundtrack. Whoever filled in provided some pleasant atmospheric synth ambience, but it lacks the depth and subtlety of Nomi's score. The reception to the Mansion of Hidden Souls in Japan wasn't quite as positive as its predecessors. Famitsu's score only dropped 2 points, down to a 30 out of 40. Still a respectable score based on Famitsu's standards at the time. But in the Japanese Sega Saturn magazine's final ranking of all Saturn games at the end of the console's life, it ranked 749th out of 945 releases. It met utter indifference in the West, with a number of major magazines simply outright ignoring it. GamePro gave out one of its rare, unambiguously negative reviews, while Next Generation gave it a middling 3 out of 5 stars, but the review is so far off base that it seems like the reviewer didn't bother to actually play it. The Mansion of Hidden Souls isn't as easy to recommend as its Sega CD predecessor. It does have some of its own charms, but it's undeniably a sloppier and less satisfying game. However, it is very short and demands almost nothing of the player, so it might be worth a run-through, especially if you enjoyed the Sega CD game. System Sacom would return to the style again several more times, usually with more successful results, including another game that ties into the Mansion of Hidden Souls series. But that's a story for another day.
Let's get you home.